This is the final lecture in the series Principles of Ethics created for philosophy classes at Shenandoah University. I'm Professor Barry Penn-Hollar, and this lecture considers our fifth principle, the principle of fidelity. At this point, we have considered non-maleficence, beneficence, autonomy, and justice. Now we add fidelity. It is my contention that these 5 moral principles exhaust all of our moral obligations. That is to say, every legitimate moral obligation we have can be understood as an expression of one of these 5 principles. The principle of fidelity says that we should be faithful to our commitments and role responsibilities. The basic idea is this. We have a moral obligation to meet the legitimate expectations that people have of us based on specific commitments we have made and, as well, the various roles we play or assume in society and in relation to others. Paradigm examples of obligations of fidelity we might have are those related to keeping promises. If we make a promise to another person, assuming the promise is to do something that is itself moral, then we have an obligation to keep that promise. Faithfulness in our marriages may be another classic or paradigm example of what fidelity requires of us, but also fulfilling our professional responsibilities. People have legitimate expectations of us based upon the professional roles we play. Keeping those professional responsibilities is a matter of fidelity. Understanding the principle of fidelity requires that we understand a distinction between what have been called general and special obligations. We've seen this already in terms of the distinction between general and special rights. The idea here is similar. General obligations refer to the moral responsibilities that all persons are thought to have toward all others. They are sometimes called impersonal because our personal relationship to a particular person is irrelevant with respect to these obligations. They're called impartial because we are not allowed any partiality or any preference for one person over another in fulfilling our obligations related to the principles we've talked about: non-maleficence, beneficence, autonomy, and justice. We have said these principles apply to all people and to all people equally. Special obligations are moral responsibilities that some particular persons have toward others with whom they have some particular relationship. So particular people have these obligations to particular others, not all people to all others. These are sometimes called role responsibilities or role-specific obligations. Now, the principle of fidelity is a general obligation in the sense that we should be prepared to meet all people's legitimate expectations of us based on whatever commitments we might have made to them or whatever roles we play in relation to them. However, our specific commitments and roles create obligations to certain people we don't have to others. So in that sense, fidelity points us towards special obligations rather than general ones. So think of this example. One should be willing to keep his or her promises to whomever they are made. One would be wrong to say, well, I'm not obligated to keep my promises to such and such a person because something excludes them from my moral responsibility. However, having made a promise to Guillermo, for example, that I didn't make to Joaquin, I now have obligations to Guillermo that I don't have to Joaquin. In that sense, fidelity points us towards special obligations. Or consider this. I should be willing to be a good professor to any and every person who might become my student. In that sense, my role responsibilities related to the principle of fidelity are general. They apply to everyone. However, having become your professor, I now have obligations to you that I don't have to other persons, to other students who are not in my class, to people who are not students at Shenandoah University. In that sense, my role responsibilities are specific or special. Dr. William F. May, formerly a professor of theological ethics at Southern Methodist University and other places, has defined two models for understanding role responsibilities or professional responsibilities that are very helpful in terms of illuminating the nature of those responsibilities. He distinguishes between what he calls a contract model and, by contrast, a covenantal model for understanding role responsibilities or professional responsibilities. When we sign a contract with someone, our responsibilities related to that contract and specific to that contractual relationship are, according to May, intentionally created. As such, one's obligations are specified by the agreement between the parties involved. Whatever the agreement was determines the exact shape of each party's obligations. In that sense, in a contractual relationship, one's obligations are clearly defined. There is no doubt or no ambiguity about them. May says that contractual relationships are limited ones in that when one fulfills the specific obligations that one has under the contract, the relationship is ended. It's over. Of course, so long as the other party also fulfills their obligations under the contract. Because our relationship is limited, May contends contractual relationships do not define our personal identity. Covenantal relationships are also intentionally created in that we make choices that engage us in the relationship. But here he says, May says, that the intentionality is less clear. There's a sense in which we find ourselves, as a result of the decisions we have made, in a relationship with another that we never clearly or unambiguously chose. Now, the most important difference probably between contractual and covenantal relationships is that in a covenantal relationship, the obligations are not necessarily defined by the parties to the relationship. Rather, May suggests they are socially defined or defined from outside of the particular people involved in the relationship. Moreover, those obligations are less clear than contractual ones. There's an open-ended or maybe even nearly limitless element to the possible obligations that people in a covenantal relationship may have to each other. Finally, though maybe less important, May argues that in a covenantal relationship, the relationship never really ends. It's an ongoing relationship between the two parties defined by their roles. And because of this nearly limitless nature of the relationship, personal identities are clearly shaped by the relationship in a way that they are not in a contractual one. As the name implies, the contractual model draws upon our understanding of the promises that are made between two parties when they form a contract with each other. Clearly, the contract defines the particular obligations, and when those obligations are fulfilled, the contract ends and the relationship is over. Maybe the best way to think of covenants is to think about marriages. Marriages are like covenants in that the two parties to the marriage do not define the terms of their relationship. Rather, there's a societal definition of what marriage is about. Consider this example. If I were to propose to someone suggesting a 5-year contract and proposing that our marriage be one in which I was allowed to have several outside sexual partners, I think even if someone agreed to that, we would say, wait a minute, you aren't married. That's not what a marriage is. Society defines what a marriage is. And consider the traditional marriage vow, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer. That's a pretty open-ended commitment. The exact responsibilities that one will have in the marriage are not spelled out in the particular commitment one makes. It's open-ended. Now, the question that May raises, and the question that his distinction between contracts and covenants raises, is which one is a better way of understanding professional roles or responsibilities? I should be faithful to people's legitimate expectations of me as a professor or in whatever role I play. Now, do I understand the nature of those obligations in contractual terms or covenantal terms? May suggests that the covenantal model is preferable. And the basic idea is this, and let me offer you this example. I have certain responsibilities to you, and you have certain expectations of me that we have never specifically or intentionally or clearly agreed upon. But where did you get those expectations? Well, you got them because we have a vaguely defined but shared societal sense of what the proper relationship and role of a professor to a student is. We have a societally defined set of expectations that determine what is a good teacher. I would argue I have the obligation to live up to those expectations, even though you and I never specifically agreed to them. And the same would be the case with doctor-patient relations and a variety of other professional client relationships. Another interesting issue related to the principle of fidelity has to do with citizenship, and particularly our obligation as citizens to obey the law. Let's think about our moral obligation to obey the law. As we've seen in several places in these podcasts, morality and law are related, but they are distinct. They're not identical. Now, surely we have a moral obligation to obey laws that are morally justified. That is to say, we have a moral obligation to obey laws that legitimately prohibit immoral activity or require of us to do things that our moral beliefs would regard as obligatory for us. So think of it this way: some laws prohibit harmful acts and are therefore consistent with the principle of non-maleficence. Some laws promote people's welfare and are therefore consistent with beneficence. Some laws require us not to interfere with others illegitimately and are consistent with autonomy. Some laws require us to fulfill our contractual and professional responsibilities, and those clearly are consistent with the principle of fidelity. So clearly we have a moral obligation to obey such laws, independent of their status as legitimate laws. Put differently, those laws obligate us to behaviors that we are obligated to even if they were not enshrined in our legal codes. But what about laws that are not inherently moral, but simply regulate and coordinate complex human activities? Think, for example, of traffic laws. There's nothing inherently wrong about driving on the left side of the road, as there is something inherently wrong about killing someone for no good reason. Now, of course, obeying such laws does prevent harm and promotes overall human welfare, and is therefore consistent with both non-maleficence and beneficence, but not inherently so. That is to say, as I've already said, there's nothing inherently wrong about driving on the left-hand side of the road, except that we've agreed to drive on the right. But here's where matters get interesting. Are we obligated to obey such laws, laws that have no inherent moral status, when we believe they are ineffective or unfair in some way? What is our obligation to obey laws we disagree with, in other words? Some would argue that obedience to such laws is a matter of justice or fairness. Consider, for example, laws prohibiting billboards in certain locations or restricting what one may do with one's property in certain areas. Now, there's nothing inherently immoral, probably, about the activities prohibited, but if one were to disobey those laws, it would give one an unfair advantage over other businesses who were obeying such laws. Right now, there's an ongoing controversy in Albemarle County where the owner of I think it's a Burger King restaurant, objects to the laws regulating signage in his area, and he is mounting civil disobedience against those laws. But some would argue that to the degree he disobeys those laws, he is giving himself an unfair advantage over other business owners, other restaurateurs who do obey the laws. And in a democratic society, there are mechanisms in place for changing the laws one thinks are ineffective. So some might argue justice requires that business owner obey those laws. Others, however, would point more to the principle of fidelity to explain any moral obligation we may have to obey laws that aren't inherently moral or to obey laws with which we disagree. The idea here would be that as citizens of a particular political community, we have an obligation to obey the laws of that community. Recall, obligations of fidelity are specific, not general ones. And so those laws that aren't matters of inherent morality may still be morally obligatory for those specific persons who are part of the community that has created those laws. Of course, so long as that community has given them possibilities of participation in the creation and reform of the legal structure that folks are required to obey. So the argument I'm explaining here is one that would say we have an obligation to obey the law, even those we disagree with, grounded in either the principle of justice or fidelity. Of course, remember, all principles are prima facie not absolute, and this includes our obligation to obey the law. So think about it. Might we be justified in breaking the speed limit law in the case of an emergency, like when we are rushing someone to the hospital who is injured? Or consider laws that are patently immoral, like the fugitive slave laws, for example, that required people in non-slave states to return runaway slaves to slavery in the South, or the laws that legalized segregation in the United States before the 1960s and 70s, and apartheid laws in South Africa that radically separated the races. Might we not argue that it's not simply that there was no obligation to obey those laws, but even more strongly that people had an obligation to engage in civil disobedience against them? In the 1980s, a man named Oliver North, who worked in the Ronald Reagan administration, was illegally sending secret aid to freedom fighters in a civil war in Nicaragua, despite the fact that such aid was specifically prohibited in laws passed by Congress. North justified his action, claiming it as civil disobedience aimed at changing an unjust law so that the United States could support freedom fighters who were worthy of our support. Is that a legitimate example, comparable to violating fugitive slave laws, of justified civil disobedience? Well, issues like these have cause some to think about possible criteria for determining when civil disobedience is morally justified, when disobeying the law is morally justified. Some have drawn upon just war theory to think about this question. And the first criteria here would be just cause. The law or practice that one is protesting and possibly disobeying must be an unjust or immoral one. Secondly, one's attempt to change the law through civil disobedience or through disobedience to the law must be a last resort. All other legal means of protest and reform must have been tried and failed, or at least be known to be futile. Third, there must be a reasonable chance of success. There's no justification for going to war or any justification for disobeying a law if one has no genuine chance of contributing to the justified change one seeks. So one must have a reasonable chance of success. And then finally, philosophers often raise the issue of proportionality. The good consequences, or the good one may legitimately expect to achieve through one's disobedience, must outweigh the bad that one produces through one's disobedience. In this case, particularly the bad one does by undermining the sense of responsibility that people have for obeying the law. Now, to address precisely that issue, many people have added this criteria. Those who engage in civil disobedience must be willing to submit to legal punishment for their disobedience. Why, you might ask, should I be willing to submit to punishment for my attempts to change an unjust law? Well, precisely to demonstrate the seriousness of my commitment and understanding of the responsibility under normal circumstances to obey the law, precisely to avoid the bad consequence of undermining respect for law and order in a society. This concludes our discussion of the fifth and final moral principle we will be using, the principle of fidelity, which requires us to live up to the people's legitimate expectations of us based upon the promises and commitments we've made and the roles we play.